The mountain valley was silent, shrouded in the heavy, cold quiet of a place long forgotten. It was here, sealed away from the erratic curves and slopes of the natural world, that the monastery of the Quadratura stood. This 17th century fortress of stone was a monument not to faith, but to geometric certainty. The founding order, the purists of the primordial angle, believed that the perfect square, formed by the convergence of four absolute right angles, was the only divine form capable of holding the universe's innate chaos at bay. Any deviation, any arc, any line that betrayed the simplicity of the straight vector was deemed a geometric sin. Arthur Finch, the Surveyor, hated the philosophical rigidity of the place, even before he knew its danger. Finch was a man who lived by the rule of terminal numbers. He trusted only what could be measured, recorded, and concluded. He was dispatched by the distant, rationalist authority to conduct a complete dimensional audit, to impose his modern, simple logic onto the stone before the site could be claimed for demolition. He arrived with his two assistants, the chainmen, armed with advanced measurement tools and the absolute conviction that every structural challenge submitted to the logic of the square. The monastery was an architectural trauma. It rose from the cold earth as a relentless succession of cubes and rectangular prisms, stacked with a brutal, unflinching fidelity. There were no decorative curves, no sloping roofs, only the hard, unyielding fact of the perpendicular meeting the perpendicular. Every wall met the floor at the exact right angle. Finch and the chainmen entered the main reception hall, the chamber of the first quadrant. It was a massive, empty cube, where the air was thick, still, and strangely resistant to sound. It felt less like a room and more like a captured volume of space, perfectly confined. Chainman Alpha, Finch commanded, fighting the unnatural stiffness in his own voice. Set the datum point. We verify the perpendicularity. The chainmen began their initial measurements. Using their sensitive digital protractors, they tested the four corners of the room. The readings came back instantly. The junctions were perfect. They met at the absolute right angle without the slightest deviation, a precision impossible to achieve with 17th century tools. Finch felt a chill that transcended the physical cold. It was the feeling of being observed by a force that enforced its own perfection. Next, Finch moved to the critical test, the internal truth of the square. He measured the four sides, verifying they were of equal, fixed length, 12 measured units. Then, he performed the diagonal measurement, spanning the distance from the southwest corner to the northeast corner. This was the line that contained the secret. According to the simple rule of the square, the length of this diagonal line should be easily expressible, like a simple fraction or whole number. But Finch knew the mathematical truth. The diagonal held within it the irrationality of the square, a length that could never be written simply, a number that continued forever without pattern or end. It was the necessary chaos hidden inside the perfect order. Finch stretched his laser tape. The reading registered a long, trailing series of digits. It was an unending number, filling the display with a numeric infinity that mocked Finch's commitment to finite closure. The stone room, built as the epitome of human reason, physically embodied the cosmic chaos of an unending ratio. He recorded the data, placing his rectangular datapad on a stone ledge. It was at this moment that the geometric hostility began. Chainman Beta, needing to retrieve a tool, moved quickly. Instead of following the strict path along the walls, he cut across the center of the room, drawing an imaginary forbidden line, a diagonal vector, with his movement. The retaliation was instantaneous and silent. A low, resonant grinding sound scraped from the solid stone. The air pressure in the room did not move the chainman. Instead, the physical dimensions of the room itself changed, focusing the tension directly onto the path the chainman had taken. The two opposite walls of the chamber did not visibly move, but Finch's secondary monitoring equipment screamed a warning. The distance between them had been reduced. The room was shrinking along the diagonal vector, attempting to eliminate the forbidden line the chainman had created. Chainman Beta screamed, collapsing to his knees. He was not crushed, but he was trapped, pinned between two invisible, compressive fields generated by the contracting geometry. The pressure released as quickly as it came, forcing the walls back to their 12-unit span with a violent, deafening thud. "It's correcting my position." Chairman Beta gasped, terrified. The room punished the diagonal. Finch's fear crystallized into realization. The tyranny of the four right angles was literal. The monastery was a mechanism built by the monks to punish the presence of irrationality, the chaos represented by the diagonal line. The structure sought to eliminate any human or material acknowledgement of the unending truth hidden within the square. Finch knew then that his mission was not merely to survey a building, but to confront a sentient, malevolent order built into the stone itself. To survive, he had to become perfectly rectilinear. From this moment forward, Finch declared, his voice hard, "Our movements must mirror the stone. Zero or the absolute right angle. No curves, no slants, no shortcuts. We will move only horizontally and vertically. Our compliance is the only defense against the tyranny." Their immediate goal was the primary axiom chamber, the subterranean heart of the monastery where the monks must have stored the original charter, the rulebook for the unyielding square. Finch knew that somewhere within that core, there had to be the secret to this enforced perfection. But to reach it, they had to navigate a structure that viewed natural, flowing human movement as an act of treason. The fear that gripped Arthur Finch and Chairman Beta was no longer a philosophical dread. It was a learned, physiological response to the absolute certainty of geometric law. They had witnessed the walls of the chamber of the first quadrant shunt inward to erase the forbidden line, the diagonal path taken by their fallen companion. The tyranny of the four right angles was real, active, and immediate. Finch forced his scientific mind into a state of brutal, mechanical compliance. He had to be less human, less organic, and more perfectly rectilinear than the stone surrounding them. "Listen closely," Finch commanded, his voice sharp and steady, overriding the raw grief in the remaining chairman's eyes. "The purest philosophy is our only map. This structure sees the diagonal, the length that cannot be simply written, the irrational truth, as a fatal flaw. We must not acknowledge it, physically or mentally. We move only along the zero and the perpendicular." They began their traverse toward the subterranean levels, where the primary axiom chamber lay. The path was a series of narrow, interlocking corridors and square-cut access halls, a geometric maze designed by fanatics. The effort to maintain the movement code was agonizing. They moved like broken automata, one step perfectly straight, an abrupt, rigid pivot, then another step perfectly straight. The human body is built on flowing curves and diagonal momentum. Forcing it into sharp, perpendicular vectors generated physical discomfort and immense mental strain. Every muscle adjustment, every shift of weight, felt like a deliberate act of will against a terrifying natural impulse. In the first long corridor, a vertical rectangle leading to the eastern wing, Chairman Alpha stumbled. It was a minor error. His foot caught on a microscopic imperfection in the floor, causing his body to list slightly to the side. For a fraction of a second, his body created a diagonal vector, an unacceptable slant against the perfect perpendicularity of the walls. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Finch heard a high-pitched, grinding shriek emanating from the stone. The ceiling of the corridor, which had been perfectly level, suddenly tilted. It did not merely drop, it skewed, rotating along the axis of the north wall, instantly transforming the corridor into a steep, lethal rhombus. The sudden change in geometry forced Chairman Alpha into an uncontrollable slide along the new, imposed diagonal slope. "Hold the line. Stay perpendicular to the ground." Finch yelled, knowing that any attempt to brace himself would solidify the geometric sin. But the chainman, overwhelmed by panic and the unexpected slope, instinctively reached out and grabbed a vertical stone support beam, pulling his body into a desperate, sharp diagonal tension against the wall. He was, in essence, creating a counter-diagonal of force. The monastery punished the ultimate failure of compliance. The wall beam did not crack, it rotated. The entire vertical surface to which the chainman clung violently twisted inward, creating a lethal, crushing corner where previously there had been only flat stone. The pressure was enormous, precisely localized, designed only to eliminate the vector of the chainman's body. The stone performed its work with absolute, silent, geometric efficiency. When the twisting stopped, the chainman's body was folded into the impossible angle, crushed and completely eradicated from the square's perfect space. The pressure released. The ceiling instantly snapped back to its perfect horizontal alignment with a final, resonant thud. The stone beam rotated back to its absolute vertical position. The corridor was once again a perfect, empty rectangle, save for the dark residue staining the junction of the floor and wall. The tyranny of the four right angles had executed its verdict on the divergence of the diagonal. Finch felt a profound terror, but beneath it, a cold, surgical clarity. He realized the monks had designed this not just to kill, but to force the survivors to adopt their absolute philosophy. The survival mechanism was full, unquestioning mental and physical submission to the rectilinear code. "There is no mourning," Finch stated, his voice flat. "There is only the line." He broke the line, and the line broke him. They continued their descent toward the subterranean levels. They reached the main staircase, a perfect spiral built entirely of squared stone blocks. The spiral, itself a contradiction to the square's law, was a geometric compromise. It allowed vertical movement while forcing the use of successive, tiny diagonal steps. The danger here was profound, as the stairs were a constantly shifting field of potential divergence. Finch led the way, stepping down with excruciating, millimeter-perfect control. He treated each stair tread as a separate, flat plane, ensuring his weight distribution was strictly vertical, never allowing his momentum to shift laterally. They moved as if their bones were made of interlocking squares. At the bottom of the long descent lay the entrance to the primary axiom chamber. The passage was blocked, not by a conventional door, but by a chilling, deliberate geometric affront, a portal built as a skewed rhombus. The square archway had been twisted off its perpendicular axis, leaning slightly to the left, creating angles that were visibly off-true, marginally wider and marginally narrower than the exact right angle. It was a geometric sin built into the core structure. Finch examined the portal with his scanner, which reported the distortion without specifying the exact figures. The stone was ancient and utterly intact. It had not shifted due to age. It had been built this way. "This is the truth," Finch whispered to the chainman. "The entire monastery enforces the right angle, but the entrance to the very source of the rule violates it. They built a fundamental flaw at the point of origin." Finch's deduction solidified into a terrible truth. The tyranny of the four right angles was not a curse imposed by an external force. It was a self-punishing mechanism built by the purists. They had built a perfect square structure to enforce perfect order. But the primary axiom chamber, the source of the rule, was deliberately flawed. This initial, hidden flaw in the core forced the rest of the monastery, the 90-degree structure, to violently maintain its perfection, punishing any deviation to prevent the infection of the skewed axiom from spreading. To stop the executions, Finch had to neutralize the original geometric sin. He needed to find a way to make the entire monastery structurally accept the necessary divergence. He needed to calculate the necessary flaw that would stabilize the pew structure against the slightly off-true core. But first, he had to get past the intentionally skewed gateway, the visible sign of the original geometric treason. The skewed axiom portal stood before Arthur Finch and the last remaining chainman, a deliberate, profound geometric lie built into the very foundation of the monastery's faith. It was a doorway constructed with angles that were marginally off-true from the perfection of the right angle, forming a warped rhombus that mocked the perpendicular geometry of the world above. Finch understood the terror of the portal. It was a test of philosophy, not physics. The structure demanded absolute compliance to the right angle in the face of a visible flaw. To acknowledge the deviation, to attempt to physically correct the skewed frame or to treat it as anything other than a boundary, would be to introduce a vector of treason and invite instant obliteration. The monks built the outside world as a defense mechanism, Finch explained, his voice low and tight. They believed the square was divine, but they feared the truth of their own skewed axiom. We must approach the sin with the order of the faith. Finch studied the precise, square indentations on the floor near the entrance. These were clearly meant for ceremonial foot placements. They were aligned perfectly with the rectilinear geometry of the descent tunnel, maintaining the zero and perpendicular lines, even though they stood directly before the skewed frame. Finch placed his feet into the indentations, forcing his body into a perfect square alignment, a rigid posture that felt utterly unnatural. Chainman Beta mirrored his movements, the fear in his eyes battling the mechanical rigidity of his stance. "We must not generate a diagonal force," Finch stated. He moved his arm, not forward, but strictly downward, then paused, then strictly horizontally inward, placing his gloved hand flat against the stone of the skewed portal. He executed the action in two perfect, distinct rectilinear vectors. A low, subterranean grinding sound resonated from within the depths of the mountain. The portal did not attempt to correct its imperfect angles. Instead, the skewed rhombus of stone unlocked. It pivoted inward, rotating around an axis that did not exist in stable, everyday space, revealing a vertical drop into absolute, silent darkness. They had passed through the threshold of the geometric sin by offering the gift of absolute compliance. They descended into the primary axiom chamber. This subterranean vault was the true nucleus of the chaos. It was vast, built of massive, interlocking blocks of dark stone. Unlike the chambers above, this room was not perfectly square. It was intentionally elongated, a subtle rectilinear distortion designed to hold the anxiety of the founders. The air here was heavy, charged not with cold, but with the palpable energy of centuries of enforced order. At the center of the chamber stood the Regulator, a colossal, monolithic stone cube, 12 units high, perched upon a square pedestal. Strange artifacts, stone prisms, perfect octahedrons, and geometrically complex carvings were scattered around the cube, all dedicated to the glorification of the perpendicular line. This cube was the physical mechanism that enforced the 90-degree law on the entire mountain. Near the Regulator, Finch spotted a small, ancient wooden lectern holding a heavy, iron-bound volume. This was the charter of the primordial angle, the rulebook of the purists. Finch rushed toward the lectern, meticulously maintaining his required rectilinear movements. He ignored the Regulator, sensing the charter held the philosophical key to the mechanism's control. He opened the heavy, brittle pages. The text was archaic, philosophical, and laced with complex geometric diagrams that he instinctively recognized as containing the numerical truths he was forbidden to voice. He quickly found the central dogma, the absolute mandate of the right angle. But the next paragraph revealed the heart of the horror. Though the divine square grants us protection, it contains within its heart the length that defies the very notion of simple, finite number. This forbidden line, the line that runs between the corners, is the weakness of the square. Therefore, the structure shall be imbued with a sacred duty to violently reject and eliminate any physical acknowledgement of the forbidden line, lest its unyielding, unending truth dismantle the divine order we have imposed. The text confirmed Finch's deduction. The tyranny was a self-punishing defense mechanism. The monks, terrified of the irrationality contained within the square form, had built the monastery to auto-correct any acceptance of that irrationality. The external structure fought its own internal, unyielding chaos. The solution was not to destroy the system, but to break its philosophical directive. Finch had to introduce such a profound, controlled divergence that the Regulator would seize, permanently locking the monastery in a state of stable, albeit flawed, geometry. He had to calculate the exact degree of error needed to balance the skewed axiom, without causing the entire 90-degree external structure to instantly collapse. As Finch looked up at the monolithic Regulator, he noticed a narrow, horizontal slit near its base. This slot was the injection point for the axiom key, a blank calibration slate he carried, which, when inserted, would impose a final, defining geometric value on the entire monastery. As he reached this profound understanding, the entire chamber rumbled violently. The sound was not structural failure, but but massive stone machinery shifting. The elongated walls of the chamber were beginning to move, inching slowly inward toward the cube. The regulator had sensed the intellectual divergence, Finch's comprehension of the system's lie. It was attempting to crush him and the chamber by reducing the chamber's width, eliminating the rectilinear space they occupied. It's correcting our presence. Finch shouted to the chairman. It's deleting the knowledge. We have to reach the regulator and inject the flaw before the walls meet. There is no escape but through the necessary era. The movement of the walls was slow, measured, and absolute, a geometrically perfect, timed execution. Finch knew he had less than 10 minutes before the relentless tyranny of the four right angles rendered their shared space non-existent. The primary axiom chamber was executing its verdict. The walls of the subterranean vault, vast but finite, were beginning their slow, silent march inward, driven by the monolithic regulator at the room's center. The monk structure was attempting to crush the source of the intellectual divergence. Finch's forbidden knowledge of the skewed axiom and the forbidden line. Arthur Finch and the last remaining chairman were forced into an impossible game of geometric survival. The chamber was already several feet narrower than when they entered. The reduction was mathematically precise. The chamber maintained its perfect rectilinear shape. Only the distance between the parallel surfaces was decreasing, meticulously reducing the space allotted for human life. How much time? Finch demanded, his eyes fixed on the moving wall, his voice tight. 2 paces left, Professor, the chairman whispered, his body rigid against the perpendicular line of the floor. Maybe 7 minutes before the regulator is unreachable. Finch felt the mounting pressure, both physical and psychological. He was trapped between the cold, crushing reality of the closing walls and the intellectual urgency of the solution. The necessary flaw was not a physical tool. It was a conceptual error he had to program into the axiom key, a key that would disrupt the entire monastery's core command. He began to calculate, not with his scanner, which had already seized from the conflicting spatial tensions, but with the cold, unyielding logic of the purist's own charter. The problem was multi-layered. 1. The external monastery demanded the absolute right angle. 2. The regulator was correcting to eliminate the forbidden line, the irrational diagonal. 3. The original core, the skewed axiom, was built with angles that were intentionally off-true. The flaw could not be 0, which would merely restart the perfection cycle. It could not be excessive chaos, which would cause the entire structure to collapse into a lethal, random mess. The flaw had to be an accepted, permanent, yet manageable imperfection, a stable error. Finch realized the flaw was philosophical, not numerical. The monks feared the irrationality, the unending truth of the diagonal, because it broke their illusion of finite, human-controlled order. To stop the tyranny, the regulator had to be forced to accept that the forbidden line was not an error to be corrected, but a fundamental, stable truth. He looked at the monolithic regulator cube at the center of the shrinking room. The cube itself was perfect, its surfaces meeting at the absolute perpendicular. Yet, the small slit near its base, the injection point for the axiom key, was perfectly square. The key must not simply introduce a skewed angle. It must introduce a measurement that forces the system to acknowledge the irrationality, the exact, unending length of the diagonal, as a basic, fixed unit of measurement, overriding the monk's mandate to eliminate it. Arthur Finch stood rigid upon the stone pedestal, his body aligned to the perfect vertical axis of the regulator cube. The monolithic machine loomed over him, its stone surfaces meeting at the absolute perpendicular, radiating silent, overwhelming order. The air was thrumming with a mechanical heartbeat of the tyranny, a deep, low, resonant sound that signaled maximum exertion. The walls of the primary axiom chamber were now dangerously close, just under 3 paces from the regulator's pedestal. They were closing with ruthless, geometrical efficiency, determined to erase the 2 remaining sources of human divergence. The regulator was fighting the proximity of Finch's axiom key, the carrier of the necessary flaw, with every ounce of its mechanical will. Finch brought the key, its surface inscribed with the long, non-repeating sequence representing the irrationality of the diagonal, toward the narrow injection slot at the regulator's base. As the key neared the slot, the resistance became physical. A focused, invisible wave of pressure emanated from the cube, pushing Finch backward. It was the order rejecting the impending chaos. Finch's muscles screamed against the rectilinear tension he was forced to maintain. If he bent, if he yielded to a curve, the execution would be instantaneous. He shoved the key forward again, using the last measure of his strength, but the regulator's internal gears seemed to lock. The electronic hum rose to a high, unbearable shriek. The movement of the closing walls, though slow, accelerated infinitesimally, indicating the system was diverting all energy toward crushing the flaw. "It's not working," Finch yelled above the shriek. "It's fighting the sequence. It's too much divergence at once." Chairman Beta, pinned close to the corner of the pedestal, his face etched with terminal dread, understood instantly. The regulator was designed to deal with one divergence at a time, one human failing the test of the angle, or one intellectual betrayal. But the combination of Finch's intellectual treason, the key, and the chairman's physical presence, the remaining human chaos, was overwhelming the system, making it seize in an attempt to handle both threats simultaneously. The chairman looked at Finch, his eyes clear for the first time since they entered the cursed monastery. He knew what had to be done. To give Finch the precious seconds needed to inject the flaw, he had to simplify the equation for the regulator. He had to eliminate the secondary divergence by creating an overwhelming, localized chaos that would force the regulator to pause its general function and deal with the immediate threat. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He violated the code. With a powerful, deliberate movement, the chairman pushed off the pedestal with his foot, launching his body into a perfect, soaring diagonal arc across the rapidly shrinking space of the chamber. He was not aiming for the wall. He was aiming for the precise, geometric center of the room, the point of maximum equilibrium. His body, for a horrifying second, was a living, breathing forbidden line. The regulator seized completely. The electronic shriek cut off, replaced by a thunderous, subterranean clank, the sound of massive stone gears grinding to a dead halt. The closing walls froze instantly, leaving the chamber locked in a claustrophobic, but momentarily stable, dimension. A colossal, absolute silence fell over the monastery of the Quadratura. The cessation of the grinding stone machinery, the end of the resonant hum of the regulator, left a vacuum more profound than any natural silence. The tyranny of the four right angles had ended, replaced not by freedom, but by a chilling, unstable stasis. Arthur Finch stood alone in the primary axiom chamber. The walls, which had been closing in for his final execution, were now frozen, stopped mid-movement, leaving the space in a permanently compressed, imperfect dimension. The colossal regulator cube was utterly inert, the axiom key's inscription, the endless sequence representing the irrationality of the diagonal, having forced the machine into an eternal loop of unresolvable truth. The structure was functionally dead, locked forever in its final, flawed geometry. Finch stepped down from the pedestal, no longer forcing his steps into rigid rectilinear vectors. He moved naturally, allowing his legs and spine to express the fluid arcs and curves of the human form. And the frozen stone did not react. The sense of profound, liberating relief was immense. Yet it was immediately replaced by a paralyzing psychological cost. He had achieved victory by internalizing the very chaos he was sent to eliminate. His rational mind had been shattered and remade by the necessity of embracing the unending truth. His first priority was the charter of the primordial angle. He retrieved the iron-bound volume from Electon. This book was the source code of the monk's fanatical philosophy, the written mandate that commanded the structure to fight the diagonal. As long as the charter existed, the philosophy could be revived, and the tyranny could return. Finch carried the heavy volume over to the regulator's pedestal. He did not burn it. Fire was too uncontrolled, too much of a chaotic vector. Instead, he used his own, highly precise cutting torch, originally intended for structural repair, and meticulously carved the book into exact, perfect squares and rectangles. He destroyed the charter not with random violence, but with the very order it worshipped, reducing its philosophy to mere, inert stone blocks. With the charter permanently neutralized, Finch turned his attention to finding a way out of the now labyrinthine structure. The monastery was no longer actively shifting, but it was physically locked into the strange, temporary geometry created during the execution phase. The corridors above were permanently skewed, compressed, and distorted, preserving the spatial lies generated moments before the injection of the flaw. The ascent was a traverse through a museum of geometric failure. He climbed through the staircase that was permanently locked in a state of diagonal tension, squeezing through sections where the walls were only 2 feet apart, and navigating chambers that were skewed by the crushing will of the Regulator's final efforts. Every step was a physical reminder that the space was no longer normal. It was a fixed distortion of reality, a permanent wound in Euclidean space. He eventually reached the original main level. He found the blood stain in the corridor where Chairman Alpha had fallen, the blood still adhering to the stone that had snapped back to its perfect right angle. The area around the stain was the only part of the monastery that truly achieved absolute order, having been violently cleansed of all divergence. It was there, in the main chamber of the first quadrant, that Finch made his final, terrifying decision. He could leave. He could walk out the front door, descend the mountain, and report his findings to the distant authority. He could explain the mathematical lie, the execution of his team, and the stabilization of the structure by the necessary flaw. But as he looked at the entrance, the opening leading back to the outside world of natural hillsides, randomly curved rivers, and non-perfect angles, he felt an overwhelming, paralyzing revulsion. He realized the tyranny had succeeded, not in killing him, but in corrupting his perception. His mind, forced for weeks into absolute compliance and then shocked by the acceptance of the irrationality, could no longer tolerate the natural chaos of the world. The slight curves of a rolling hill, the random placement of a rock, the casual imperfection of an unmeasured line, all of it now screamed as divergence, as uncorrected geometric sin. Finch had become the custodian of the flaw. He knew he could not re-enter the chaotic world. His mission had fundamentally altered his consciousness. The only place he felt safe, the only place where the order was strong enough, even in its flawed, frozen state, was within the walls of the Quadratura. He returned to the subterranean primary axiom chamber. He cleaned the space, treating the chamber as his new, solitary shrine. He restored power to a small auxiliary generator he had brought, establishing a minimal, internal light source. He sealed the skewed portal with lead and stone, locking himself inside the eternal stasis of the flaw. Finch settled down next to the now silent Regulator. He used its smooth, monolithic surfaces as his new desk. He began his new life's work, translating the philosophy of the destroyed charter into a new set of rules, the code of the stable flaw. He would spend his days meticulously monitoring the frozen structure, ensuring the irrationality he had injected remained stable, preventing the external world's chaos from ever forcing the monastery back into its destructive cycle of perfection. He looked around the compressed chamber, its walls inches closer than they should be, its dimensions permanently off true. It was an imperfect, unstable space, yet it was the only space where Finch felt mathematically at peace. He was the perpetual sentinel, the final guardian of a cursed structure. He had defeated the tyranny of the 4 right angles only to become its ultimate, solitary prisoner, forever bound to enforce a stable, broken order in the mountain's cold heart. The Surveyor had achieved his final, terrifying purpose. He was a man of the flaw, eternally trapped in the paradox of the unyielding square. Warning: this video contains purely fictional supernatural horror content. The events, characters, and concepts depicted are products of imagination and are not intended to promote, endorse, or normalize any harmful or illegal activities, including child abuse, sexualization, or self-harm.